Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. Thank you, Walter. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for our future reference. Leading our discussion is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Mr. Lohman began his Capitol Hill career as a policy aide to Senator John McCain. He later served as senior professional Republican staff on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. He then joined the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, where at the end of his career there, he was Senior Vice President and Executive Director. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thanks, John. Well, thank you all for coming out and for folks viewing online. I'm glad you could devote a little bit of time to Cambodia. It's always a challenge to get people focused on it, in fact, but I think developments in Cambodia nowadays are helping us a little bit in that regard. It's been a very, very difficult year. The arrest and imprisonment of CNRP leader Kem Sokha and the threats to dissolve his party are just the most recent manifestation of these tough times. And they come in the midst of a much broader crackdown on democracy in Cambodia, obviously with an eye towards next year's election. This is happening in a country where there's an international agreement, the 1991 Paris Peace Accords, that give the signatories special obligations to ensure free and fair elections and the protection of human rights. That's the language of the Paris Peace Accords. I don't think any of us really are living up to our word in that regard. We've got plenty of a panel of experts here today to give us a more complete picture of the current situation and hopefully offer some suggestions about what we can do U.S. policy-wise, but also what other countries that are signatories to the agreement can do to help Cambodia at this point. We've got 4 speakers, but we're going to do things just a little bit differently than we usually do. I'm going to invite Randy Shriver up first to maybe offer 10 minutes of opening remarks here, and then we'll turn to the panel. So just by brief introduction, Randy is president and CEO of the Project 2049 Institute, as well as a founding partner at Armitage International. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and as Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor for then Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage, both during the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration. Randy's no stranger to Heritage, actually. Heritage Stage has been here many times, and he's a frequent partner on issues related to Asia. So let me ask Randy to come up, start us off, and then I'll come back and introduce the panel.
Really appreciate it, Walter, and yeah, sometimes I feel like this is a home away from home. I don't know if I earned a smoking jacket or something after enough appearances here, but always a delight to come and participate in your programs. You do excellent work here, and it's an honor to be a part of this. And may I just say about the panelists up here, I don't know John, but I do know his work and find it very inspiring and appreciate his long-term commitment to human rights and human dignity. And Olivia is a rising star. Heritage is lucky to have her, but I'm particularly honored to be here with Mona Kem, who I count as a friend, but also as a teacher and somebody who's brought me up to speed and is very tenacious and very committed to this cause of our country and the people of Cambodia. I actually don't belong up there. I do belong in the audience. I'm not an expert. But I think some of these events don't call for expertise. In fact, you might put many of them in the category of no-brainer in terms of what's happening and what a proper response might be. But I did ask Walter if I could open up with just a few framing comments, and maybe I might add to your questions that you'll pose as moderator with some of the thoughts I put forward for the panel's consideration. But the first point, and this, you're here, you care, you're interested, people streaming care, but I think for a broader audience, it's important to underscore that this is important to the United States. This matters to the United States. It's not just the 16, 17 million people in Cambodia. It's a matter that impacts us. It impacts not only the bilateral relationship, but has regional implications. The functionality of ASEAN it could be affected. Our regional competition with China. Remember who the first significant visitor was after the arrest of Kem Sokha. It was Chinese dignitary who complimented and praised the move of the Cambodian government. Remember, this is a country that doesn't meddle in the internal affairs of others, but they were pretty quick to make comments on this. So this is important, and I think it goes beyond sort of the important role the United States should always strive to play to be a voice of support for human dignity and human rights. It has regional implications and certainly for our bilateral relationship going forward. So that's sort of a foundational point, is that this is important to us. Beyond that, I just wanted to make a few other points, and as I said, maybe pose a few questions. On learning of the arrest, Ambassador Haidt I think it was actually traveling at the time, but our ambassador in Cambodia, who replaced our very excellent ambassador, Ambassador Bill Todd. Nice to see you, Bill, and thanks for joining us. Bill also is a person of great passion who has a day job right now, has great responsibilities, but still cares deeply about Cambodia, and very nice to have you here. But our current ambassador, when he learned of the news, I thought made an excellent statement. He called and joined the EU in calling for the immediate release of Kem Sokha, but also noted some of the other backsliding, the crackdown on the media, the crackdown on civil society. But he also made a comment that he still believed there was time to salvage this election in June 2018 and the progress of democratic reform in Cambodia. So one question I think we need to pose, that still have time, was stated on September 12th. It is now into closer to mid-November. Is it reasonable to say that this election can be salvaged before June 2018? For this American citizen, I'd be highly skeptical. But I think that's an important point, because if we're working for the release, if we're working for less coercion and pressure on the opposition party, are we doing that in the hopes that this election can be salvaged, or are we doing it for a longer horizon? I think I'd be interested in the panelists' views on this, but we may very well have gone beyond a point where we can say it's possible to have a free, fair, and credible election already. I think number two, what are the broader regional implications? As I said, the Chinese have been quick to support Hun Sen and his government in these various moves. The Chinese, I think their intentions are not benign. They rarely are in Southeast Asia, but particularly when you look at the history of Cambodia, heavy Chinese involvement. I'm not speaking of investment and economic activity and trade, but when Chinese get more involved in the politics of Cambodia, it's usually not a positive thing. And in fact, the history is very tragic, to include the Chinese support for the Khmer Rouge regime, of course, being most tragic of all. So I think we need to have some notion that this is a regional issue, and how do we deal with that in terms of how we look at emerging strategic competition with China. That's another thing of interest to me. Third, what are the various tools now that are at our disposal, and how can they be used? And what are they directed at? Are we still directing our energy and focus on the June 2018 election, or are we looking more long-term and thinking about how to reinstate some progress towards democratic reform? I note that Senator McCain and Senator Durbin and Senator Cruz separately, in a separate effort, have all talked about travel restrictions on senior Cambodian officials. We do have some trade that is significant, particularly from the Cambodian perspective, and on the export side, a very significant market for them. So what are the various tools? How should they be employed? And again, what kind of horizon should we be looking at? And then finally, what does this mean for our bilateral relationship going forward? We've made a great deal of investment. Ambassador Todd invested a great deal of time, and our government has invested a lot of resources. Ambassador Haidt has had the same approach. We're active in some areas where, frankly, we have moral obligations. The demining activities, the other activities we're involved in, are things that we should be responsible for. We should have some involvement in, and I note that there was just an announcement that we may be cutting back on some of the demining activities, and I don't know if that's a political statement or if that's just resources needed elsewhere. A lot is going, of course, towards Syria and Iraq right now in this area, but we have those, I would say, obligations and moral responsibilities, but we also do want to see a future where Cambodia is a country welcome in the community of democracies, a country that can play a role in ASEAN, a country that is not just a proxy for China when we talk about issues in the region like the South China Sea and other regional issues. So irrespective of the next few months, what is the right approach to this bilateral relationship and ensuring that our equities are appropriately addressed? So again, I just wanted to put out some questions and issues to frame the discussion. And as I said, I'm not an expert. I very much look forward to hearing from these experts. So thank you, Walter.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Thank you. Very much appreciate those comments, and I second all of them, particularly the idea that this what's happening in Cambodia is important. It's important to the United States, important to the international community. And that wasn't such a stretch 25 years ago or so. Everyone agreed on that. I think in the intervening years, Cambodia has become less and less of a salient issue in discussion of our position in the region generally, but also issues of democracy and human rights. It has gradually receded from public awareness. This is a chance for us to refocus on it. I hope the panelists will forgive me for some quick introductions so we can get directly to the conversation here about the situation. First off, John Sifton. We're going to hear from John Sifton. John is Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. He's been a frequent partner of Heritage also on a range of issues, especially this one, and Burma in particular. We've worked with and had him here to talk about. John's been with Human Rights Watch since 2001.
Yeah, I left for a little bit.
Yeah, and then came back. Okay, so he's been working on these issues many years, in particular working on advocacy here in Washington, which puts him in a very important and unique position to understand the approaches that we take to this. Mona Kem, as Randy singled out, Mona really is terrific to have in town and to be able to be here at Heritage to talk about Cambodia. She's Deputy Director General of Public Affairs for the CNRP, and she's the daughter of Kem Sokha, so she has some personal connection here, but she also has a very long career professionally addressing issues important to Cambodia. She's deeply familiar with the current situation and is a passionate advocate for democracy. And then Olivia Anos. Olivia is a policy analyst in our Asian Studies Center here at Heritage Foundation. She's responsible for a portfolio of human rights, humanitarian, and democracy issues. And as Randy pointed out, she really is a rising star. You can look at her work here at on our website, but also you might see her column in Forbes every couple of weeks that she does, a couple of which have already focused on Cambodia, right? So she's doing her part to keep attention on the issue as we approach elections next year. So with that, let me turn it over to John. He can get us started, and then we'll just go down the line and hopefully have some good time for discussion.
Thanks. I'm not going to go through all the details. I think anybody with a computer can look on our website and news websites to see the deterioration of the human rights situation in Cambodia over the last 2 years. I mean, I will put it in a context. Hun Sen has been in power for 33 years, almost 33 years, and he has gone through several elections which have not been free and fair. The details of the flaws and the violations in those elections have varied over time, but in many respects what we're seeing right now is just the latest, I wouldn't say in a cycle, it's not like Groundhog Day, because it's quite different each time, but it is there is a somewhat repetitive nature to this exercise. And what I'd like to do now is what I'd like to do very quickly at the beginning is talk about why this time it's a little bit different and a little bit more frightening for Cambodia's future than in the past. In the past, Hun Sen has been content to use his dominating CPP party, the Cambodian People's Party, to essentially dominate politics, but allow opposition, civil society to have enough breathing space so that there's a patina of democratic legitimacy in Cambodia. Problem is, in the last election cycle, essentially what happened is, in his mind, Hun Sen allowed the opposition to win too many seats, and the CPP became anxious. He became, I suppose, personally anxious. I can't guess at his psychological state, but this is one theory, and realized that the CPP was under threat from an emerging opposition party, the CNRP, that was more powerful than he realized. And he did what he's always done, which is slowly dismantle the small opposition leverage in the parliament, such as it is, over time. But he escalated it in the last 2 years in a way that is a little bit different from the past. So let me just run through what's happened in the last 2 years very quickly. Even before the current crisis, CNRP's other main leader, Sam Rainsy, had an arrest warrant that everybody had forgotten about due to a defamation charge that he had been convicted of years before. And this arrest warrant was somehow revived and while he was abroad, and so he has been in exile ever since. In October of 2016, 15, two parliamentarians with the opposition party were brutally assaulted by plainclothes government agents. We did a huge amount of investigation into that incident and determined that those people who attacked those two CNRP politicians were, in fact, connected with Hun Sen's bodyguard unit. There was a law on non-governmental organizations, very restrictive law introduced in Parliament, which ultimately passed, which gives the power potent authorities, which can be abused, to basically shut down NGOs and other civil society groups they don't like. A prominent political analyst, Kem was assassinated. And this is just before this year. Okay. Then, this year, profound, actually starting last year, there was a profound escalation. There was a completely spurious charge brought against Kem Mona's father, Kem Sokha, related to a complicated so-called scandal. This charge was basically resulted in him being forced to stay in CNRP headquarters and not leave for fear of arrest for a number of months before that was finally dealt with a pardon. It was a pardon, right? Yeah. A major newspaper, English language newspaper, Cambodia Daily, was shuttered after it received an enormous tax bill, which was clearly brought against them precisely in order to economically destroy them. Radios were silenced that were broadcasting Radio Free Asia and other independent media. The televisions, of course, are all in the control of the government. And then Kem Sokha was arrested with a crazy allegation of treason in which he colluded with the U.S. government to overthrow the Cambodian government. And this dovetailed with a complete breakdown in the U.S.-Cambodian relationship. I mean, essentially, the U.S. had to demarche and summon the ambassador here in Washington. And this, of course, was augmented and worsened by the fact that the rest of the world community didn't really come to the assistance of the United States when these crazy allegations were made. I mean, they made condemnations, but it was hardly a sort of coordinated response. So these are the things we got to recognize, I think, in my mind. U.S. influence in Cambodia is at an all-time low, which perhaps explains why the U.S. didn't really coordinate a lot with EU and others. I think there may be, and this is just a theory, but there may be a reluctance in the State Department to press on Cambodia because they feel like what's the point? Our influence is so small. In any case, why make a big fuss? We counter that by saying the U.S. may have a poor relationship with Cambodia, but it has a very good relationship with Japan and the EU and others. And the U.S. could have used all those relationships to create a coalition of like-minded governments that could be together very strong, which I'll get back to in a second. Second point, but while U.S. power and leverage still, U.S. influence is at an all-time low, U.S. power and leverage still exists. I mean, there are economic levers. There is the voice and vote that the United States has on international financial institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. There's the diplomacy that I just mentioned with other governments which do have an influence over Cambodia, including China and Vietnam. And there is some involvement with military to military. And I think even though there is hardly any direct assistance, there are many regional military events and exercises at which Cambodia is present, the U.S. is also present, and those could provide opportunities for the U.S. to exert pressure on them. The whole problem, of course, is in the midst of all this, there's a North Korea crisis, the Burma-Rohingya crisis, not to mention Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, everything else. And so there has been a bandwidth problem and also a set of staffing problems at the State Department, which has made it difficult to move sort of quickly on those things like creating multilateral diplomacy that will bring to bear on Cambodia. But the last thing that we need to realize is that even with all of the pressure that the U.S. and its allies could bring on Cambodia, it still might not be enough for the simple reason that Hun Sen, as an authoritarian, is not just going to be convinced to put a metaphorical gun to his head and pull the trigger. Authoritarians don't give up power easily. And even with all of the power of the world community brought on his head, he still has China, he still has Vietnam, he still has ASEAN members who will stand beside him, and it just may not be enough. So that's why my proposal here, as we were talking about what our next steps are, is that we should probably move away from discussions and equations. I mean, we should have these discussions about how to put pressure on Cambodia, but we should also move beyond to a question where we're not talking about an equation where it's the world versus Hun Sen, but rather start thinking about the larger strategy of isolating Hun Sen as a person, both on the world stage and in Cambodia and even within the CPP, isolating him as a pariah, isolating him economically in the sense that he could perhaps be sanctioned in various fora, isolating him as a person. Alternatively, there are other theories on how to sanction governments. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a sort of opposite approach where you attack with sanctions senior government officials but leave the head alone, and that sort of builds up resentment in the rank and file. That could be a proposal too. But either way, we need to move beyond just the world versus Hun Sen, because clearly he's not a man who is going to let Same Rainsy return, let Kem Sokha out of prison, let CNRP contest next year's elections in a free and fair manner. Because I'm pretty sure everybody agrees, we can talk about this. I'm pretty sure that he thinks that if there is a free and fair election, he will lose. And so he can't be compelled to commit suicide politically. He doesn't have what Habermas would call constitutional patriotism. His interest is, in staying in power. So I'll leave it there. I mean, we can talk about all the fine print of how to get Tokyo more involved. Why are they not? Brussels, why, how can they use their leverage, especially their tariff and economic power, and all the rest, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. There are a lot of things to talk about with anti-corruption measures in Singapore and other things that could be brought to bear to bring some leverage down upon the CPP. But I'll leave it there on sort of broad strokes.
Okay,
as an introduction.
Terrific, thank you. Ona, please.
First of all, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for being a friend of Cambodia's democracy for quite some time now, and also Project 2049, that's where Randy is. Especially Olivia for putting this event together, and thank you, the panelists, John, John has been giving a lot of updates already on what's been happening, so I won't get into that. I would just focus on why it's happening and how can we reverse it. I agree with some points that you raised, and I have some slight disagreement with some. Why is it happening now? I think it is because Hun Sen thinks the world is not paying attention and no one is willing to do anything about it. Up until this moment, the Cambodian government does not believe that the US, the EU, or Japan will actually act and impose sanctions. Up until this moment, he does not believe that. And that's the problem. That's why he's moving forward to dissolving the CNRP, the main opposition, in next week on November 16, because he does not believe there's a commitment from the Paris Peace Accord signatory, from the US, from the EU, or Japan to do anything about it. So that is why he's been cracking down increasingly for the last, in the last 2 months. And just to quickly recap, the imprisonment of the Cambodian main opposition leader, he's still in prison. It's been 66 days. It's been dragged on far too long. And again, to echo what Randy was saying, that the U.S. Embassy has made a strong statement since September 12, and now it's November 7, and nothing has been done from the U.S. And this is exactly why the Cambodian government, Hun Sen in particular, is speeding up on the crackdown. And this is where I disagree a little bit with John, that to say that the U.S. doesn't have power or leverage. The U.S. does.
Sorry, I said they do. They don't have influence, but yes, they do have power and leverage.
When you have leverage, then you would have influence. And first of all, I think the international community has been approaching this with the wrong perspective. They are waiting for Hun Sen to make a move and then react. The right strategy would be to preempt, not to anticipate what the Cambodian government is going to do next, but to preempt. By waiting and anticipating what the Cambodian government is going to do next, you allow the Cambodian government to make permanent damages. Some of the damages that has been done in the last few months, for example, are permanent. And it would be too late to reverse or restore any of that. For example, the intimidation, the fear that has been casted on the Cambodian public with the cruel, unlawful arrest of Kem Sokha, that's going to be imprinted in the mind of our voters for a very long time. We cannot just change that in the next few weeks. And that's permanent. And that itself, although it's not technical, but it's completely undermined the integrity of a free, fair election. Imagine if you're an average Cambodian sitting in your village, you see his arrest, you see Kem Sokha's arrest online, on Facebook, almost live. Would you have any more desire to go to vote for the opposition? Would you have any more desire for change? You would believe that everything is under the control of the Prime Minister of the Cambodian government, and that you would lose all hope in the process of a democratic election. And that's exactly why the arrest was done in a very cruel manner. It is a show of power. It's a show of power to the Cambodian public so that they no longer want change. They would just submit to their fate for the sake of so-called peace. And it's a show of power to the CNRP ourselves, among our ranks from top to bottom, which is why a lot of us have fled the country out of fear, and rightfully so. Some of us would have been arrested if we stay in the country. So these are the damages that have been done that we cannot reverse. It's a psychological warfare that cannot be reversed, and this is a result of the international community, the donors in particular, for having the approach of wait and see instead of preempting it before it's happening. For example, November 16. The Prime Minister has made very clear that the CNRP will be dissolved. And the international community attitude so far has been, oh, we'll wait and see what's going to happen on November 16, and that is the wrong approach. You need to preempt to make sure that November 16, the Cambodian court, which is under the complete control of Mr. Hun Sen, will not dissolve the CNRP. You need to already implement all the leverages that you have, using all the leverages that you have before November 16, not after November 16. If the CNRP is dissolved on November 16, there are a lot of things that cannot be reversed, and there's absolutely no way the election next year would be free and fair. That's also what Randy was raising. Are we still hoping for a free, fair election in next year, in July next year? Time is running out. I would say that if things are not reversed by the end of this month, the latest, it is too late. It is too late to pretend that we can salvage the July 2018 election. Because, for example, voter registration began with the arrest of Kem Sokha, and it's ending on November 9. And there has been a very very low turnout in terms of registration. For obvious reason that I mentioned earlier, is because people no longer believe in the system. People no longer believe that there can be free, fair election. So yes, if the international community do not act before November 16 and things do not get resolved before the end of this month, it is too late. Then we have to look at something, look at the something longer term, bringing about democratic space for Cambodia in general once and for all, as all of the signatory of Paris Peace Accord have an obligation to do. And I want to say it's not just about the Paris Peace Accord. The US in particular and its ally, Japan, and its friend, the EU, are investing a lot in our election system. They are supporting the election system. So you have an obligation, the EU, the US, and Japan have an obligation to make sure the election is free and fair. Otherwise, you all will become accomplices in the destruction of Cambodia's democracy. So it's not just a matter of something, the Paris Peace Accord from 1991. It's about now. It's about your relationship with Cambodia today. You are supporting an election. And it's more than just technical support in terms of funding and technicality. It's about legitimacy, and you cannot underestimate legitimacy. The Cambodian government, Cambodia needs the Western or the free world legitimacy in order to open up the country, in order for the country to grow. And I believe that the Prime Minister and the Cambodian government understand that really well, despite their rhetoric, public rhetoric. So I do believe that the US, the EU, Japan, the like-minded country who have been pouring a lot of support into Cambodia do have leverages that they can use. And they still have time. They still have time to act before the end of this month to make sure that the election in next year in July will be free and fair. And again, with the US leverage, I think there's a difference between leverage and credibility. You have to look at that. The US has leverages that would transform into pressure. With leverage, that can become pressure. But the problem now, there has been a 1 year of anti-US campaign. Why? By the Cambodian government. It's exactly to discredit the US. So you have leverage, but can you use it now that they're attacking your credibility? And it's done by design. That's why the Cambodian government has been attacking the US for over a year. And it's the US own reluctance to respond that has been dragging for so long. It's been a year. The US has done nothing to even stand up for itself. And now the U.S. is the intention of the Cambodian government attacking the U.S. is for the U.S. to shy away from speaking up on democracy and human rights issue in Cambodia. The anti-U.S. campaign is precisely designed to do that, and the U.S. is actually falling for that. It's being shy away from being close to democracy, or that they would link the U.S. to the Cambodian opposition, and this is done by design. And I think the U.S. should be proud. Instead of shy away from supporting democracy in Cambodia. The US should not allow the Cambodian government to label the US promotion of democracy in Cambodia as revolution. Otherwise, you live by the rules that are defined by the dictator. If you are a father of democracy and you live by the rule of the dictator, you should not even exist in Cambodia to begin with. So the US should be proud of the work that it has invested in Cambodia for the last 20 years in support of democracy. The reason why there has been a desire for change, the reason why the Cambodian public understand their rights, understand the importance of free, fair election, it's because of the investment coming from places like the US, mainly the US, on promotion of democracy. So the US should take pride in that and continue to defend your investment in democracy that's going to go full bloom next year if we have free, fair election. And Cambodia can actually serve as an example, an inspiration to the rest of the region where hope for democracy is very little. In Cambodia, democracy is still very possible. It's still very likely because the majority of the population is ready for it. They just need space to transform their desire into positive changes. So the US should work with its ally, Japan, and its friend at the EU to help Cambodia tell an inspiring story to the region instead of being shy away from it because the U.S. is afraid by the rules and the definition of democracy and revolution that's being dubbed by the Cambodian government. So I believe the U.S. does have a role, and if the U.S. does not act, I don't think any other country would act. The U.S. needs to take the lead. The U.S. needs to work with its ally in a coordinated effort, which I agree with John, that hasn't been happening yet. The U.S. needs to work with Japan, with the EU, because there is leverage. more than 70% of Cambodian export is going to the EU and the US market. How can this regime survive if you actually impose sanction, especially targeted individual sanction as well, as John mentioned? I won't get into that. But it worked, sanction work, and every time the international community stand by democratic movement in Cambodia, it works. For example, last year when Kem Sokha was under office arrest for about 6 months, it took the international community to get him out. It worked whenever you act, but it's a matter of timing right now. We're running out of time, and if there's no action by the end of this month, the course is not reversed by the end of this month, then it is too late. And you have yourself to blame for the wait and see strategy. So how to move forward for the international community, you need to preempt, not react.
Good. Thank you very much. Olivia?
So in 2013, Walter and I actually wrote a paper in response to the 2013 elections where there were allegations of fraud and serious challenges already in the Cambodian political system. And it sort of feels like a here we go again. But at that time, actually, your father came and visited us here at Heritage, and he said, you know, you've sort of, you're on to something. You got something right. You got the diagnosis of the Cambodian political climate correct. And I really wish that Walter and I had been wrong, because I don't think we would be sitting in this situation that we're in right now, where Cambodia is really in a bad spot. And I wish that the situation were not so bad, because it would be much better to have Kem Sokha here speaking today about his vision for freedom in Cambodia. But I think today, sort of the mirage of Cambodian democracy is being shattered entirely, and that's unfortunate. And I'm so encouraged that Mona is saying that the people of Cambodia really want democracy. And so I hope that, you know, it's not a completely shattered hope, and that it can get on the path toward political reform. And I hope some of our comments here today can sort of move us in that direction. Being the last speaker, I sort of have the difficult, job of having to follow such wonderful people. But I won't recap what's going on. Obviously, Kem Sokha is in prison. The dissolution of the opposition party is on the table, but I do want to pause for just a moment. It seems like the crackdown on civil society this time around is even stronger. And I think that's a point that's worth looking at, because that is the area where the Cambodian people have the most ability to voice their opinions. And we've seen, even in the lead up to Kem Sokha's arrest, the shutdown not only of the Cambodia Daily Press, Radio Free Asia has discontinued its services. You also saw basic civil society groups, including anti-trafficking groups, being shut down, things where the Cambodian government is actually usually open to this type of coordination. And even in these areas, these small hopes of civil society openings seem to be closing even further. So the scale of this crackdown, as John said, is certainly substantial and seems to be getting even worse. I also wanted to reiterate that there are significant reasons why the U.S. should absolutely act in this situation. And the first, we've talked about the Paris Peace Agreement, but I want to re-emphasize how important it is that the signatories actually agreed to come to Cambodia's aid in the event that democracy was backsliding. And I want to read the quotes that are directly from the Paris Peace Agreement. The signatories should promote and encourage respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Cambodia, and also ensure the right of self-determination to the Cambodian people to have free and fair elections. This is a direct quote from the Paris Peace Agreements. And so this is something that the U.S. agreed to in 1991. It's now 26 years later, and that agreement still stands, and that means the U.S. should be acting. But beyond that, I think there are two other reasons why the U.S. is invested in Cambodia that sort of add to a lot of what Randy was saying earlier. But the U.S. has invested in Cambodia since it went through the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge, and has been invested in Cambodia and has an interest in seeing human rights restored and in seeing democracy restored there. And so I think that this long history demonstrates that there's a relationship and a history there that should lead to action beyond just the basic signing of the Paris Peace Agreement. And I think critically, and this is, of course, not only the case in Cambodia, it's certainly the case in other countries as well. Promoting freedom in one part of the world is good for freedom everywhere in all parts of the world. And so, I mean, already in Southeast Asia, we're seeing severe issues of democracy and human rights. Burma is certainly coming to mind right now with everything going on with the Rohingya. But I think that we have an interest in making sure that Cambodia is able to get on a path toward political reform and stay there, because I think it also benefits Southeast Asia and also benefits U.S. influence in the region as a whole. So I want to spend the last bit of my remarks sort of looking at what is the way forward on Cambodia. And I have some short-term things that can be done, but I also don't want to lose sight of some of the longer-term issues that we can work on in Cambodia too. The first is that I think the U.S. should absolutely consider instituting a visa ban against all Cambodian officials who are involved in undermining democracy. Whether or not, as John said, this would be Hun Sen himself, or this would be some of the higher CPP party cadres, you could have individuals who could be placed on the specially designated nationals list for one tool. I think the one that may actually be more relevant and is less used is the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a newer authority that U.S. Congress passed, and it allows the U.S. government to go after individuals for committing human rights abuse or for being involved in corruption, both of which I think are relevant in the Cambodian case. Another area is Congress is already taking leadership in the area of visa bans because the state foreign ops bill has provisions in it. It's currently under consideration that would put in place a visa ban and also consider different travel restrictions and other forms of restrictions on Cambodian officials. So this is another area where the Trump administration could perhaps even endorse this language and sort of get movement fairly quickly. The second thing that could be done is I think you need to publicly and privately press for the release of Kem Sokha. And I think in those conversations, you can also talk about other backslides in democracy. It doesn't have to be exclusively focused on Kem Sokha, but a public statement could be particularly useful, or a private statement from a high-ranking official, perhaps even from Rex Tillerson or Nikki Haley, that go beyond just basic statements, but are really, really saying that the U.S. government is going to act. The third thing, and this is getting more into long-term solutions, would be to form a Cambodia contact group in response to the Paris Peace Agreement. So you could identify a couple of countries that are really forward-leaning on these issues, perhaps Japan, some members from the EU, France, Australia, the UK, all could be formed to sort of brainstorm what a long-term strategy would look like to get Cambodia back on the road to democracy and to make sure that the signatories are fulfilling the obligations that they have under the Paris Peace Agreement. Again, another long-term solution would be to ensure that the U.S. and also other Western nations are able to have election monitors if the elections are, in fact, able to go forward. This was a problem in the 2013 elections. Not everyone was able to get permission to monitor the elections, but organizations like NDI, IRI, the Carter Center, and the EU have sometimes provided election monitoring in the past, and this could be very good. Another potential solution would be to review the aid and assistance that the U.S. currently sends to Cambodia. Some of the areas of assistance that are helpful for ensuring a democratic outcome of elections should most likely remain in place, but perhaps there are some other areas that could be either threatened to be revoked or actually revoked on the basis of the activities that are going on right now. And then finally, I wanted to just say that I think in the midst of this, we also forget about other political prisoners in addition to Kem Sokha that still remain in prison in Cambodia, and that should continue to be a focus of the U.S. government, whether that's State Department, the National Security Council, and others. So with that, I hope we're able to have a good conversation about the way forward.
Good, great. Thank you, Livia. I'm particularly pleased to hear you go through all those options, because that's sort of a heritage hallmark to get directly to solutions and suggestions for policy. So that was very useful. Well, I want to open it up to questions, and I know that people sometimes require a couple minutes to think through what they find most important to get at. So I have a couple questions. Actually, I have about a dozen, but I'm only going to ask a couple. John, I wanted to ask you. You talked about the EU and the role that Brussels could play, and I could see that they just had a delegation in Cambodia that seemed like it was on the verge of action, or at least suggesting some action back to the Commission, if not doing something in the Parliament themselves. But there's this complex relationship between the EU and its member states, and sometimes the member states hide behind Brussels. I don't want to put it in too negative a way, but I can't think of a better way to characterize it. They hide behind the EU as a way not to do anything. Is there a role for the member states themselves to actually play, and not just rely on the EU itself to take action?
Yeah, the quick answer is, yeah, they can leave behind the EU. I think that's what we're doing in Burma right now, because we can't get a consensus on the Burma position at the EU vis-a-vis a lot of different things because of the intransigence of Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Greece, for different political reasons. So you have all of the EU held hostage by 4 governments which have not been able to allow consensus. And so we've gone, and this is Burma, we've gone to EU member states and said, just give up on an EU common position and have a coalition of like-minded EU states on your position. I think the same thing could be said of Cambodia.
And that's working?
Well, we just that strategy is literally like a day old. Because there's one more foreign ministers meeting next Monday, and then we'll officially declare EU unity dead on arrival on Burma. So this is similar to Cambodia. I think if you feel like the EU is being weak and that members are hiding behind it, then absolutely go to the member states, some of whom signed the Paris Peace Agreement, along with Indonesia, another country that often gets overlooked.
Do the Chinese complicate things on this within Europe? You know, because they play that role on some other big strategic issues like South China Sea. Do they care about it enough that they actually will complicate things in the EU, complicate their ability to reach consensus?
I don't know if people wake up in Beijing thinking about Cambodia.
They wake up
Probably
in Brussels
not,
thinking
but
about Cambodia.
Yeah, I think the thing to note here is that China and Vietnam, which has a lot of influence over Hun Sen as well, because of the close military-to-military relationship, both could be pressured to not support him so wholly if there was an interest in that. But the problem is, I think, when you divvy up all the political capital that the United States exercises with China, getting joy on Cambodia is like 1,000th on the list of items that need to be accomplished with China. And it's probably 20th on the list of its asks with Vietnam. But in a perfect world, you could go to Hanoi, like they are right now. They're going there right now this week, both the president and the Secretary of State. And you could say to them, you know, we want tariff reductions on this, that, and the other thing, just U.S.-Vietnam-related issues. And then say, oh, by the way, Cambodia, can you just stop supporting this guy so much? I mean, can you just go easy on this? Because if you do that, it will imperil our relationship as well. You could add that into the mix. Will they do that? I doubt it, but they could. And that's the leverage I'm talking about. And just, I wanted to say one quick thing about leverage. I think what I meant by influence was diplomatic influence. I mean, the capacity, this is what I wrote down, the capacity to ask for something and have it happen without having to offer incentives or threaten punishments. So that's what I meant by influence. And by that measure, U.S. influence is dead. That's why we have to use leverage. We have to use carrots and sticks.
That's a good clarification. Mona, I wanted to think through with you a little bit the impact of U.S. support. You know, was it 2 weeks ago when Senator Cruz sent a letter about your father's detention, et cetera, and the reaction was very much, an attempt to tar him as a product of the United States. The United States getting involved here, it's just more evidence to the fact that Kem Sokha is not, committed to the country. He's basically supported by outsiders, et cetera. Is that a real problem for us? That is, if the United States is too closely associated with CNRP or too closely associated with an effort to, push for a political situation that actually will result in Hun Sen's departing power. I mean, because a free election would not necessarily be in his interest. So is there a downside to association with the United States, too close an association with the United States?
I don't think there's a downside at all, and that's precisely there's an anti-U.S. campaign in this invention of the U.S. Conspiracy to overthrow him. It is to preempt the U.S. from standing up for democracy and human rights in Cambodia. So if that's the goal of the ruling party of the Cambodian government and the U.S. respond exactly the way they anticipated the U.S. would respond, you're playing by the rules and the definition that's put in place by the dictator. And it's not just the U.S., as you know. For example, in the last two months, there has been a lot of strong statements, actually even stronger than the U.S., coming from other parts of the world. But yet, the Cambodian government chose to focus on the U.S., so it's cynical. It is cynical. The anti-U.S. Attack, the invention of the color revolution conspiracies is done by design. It's cynical to make the U.S. shy away from speaking up. And if the U.S. following that, then the U.S. is allowing the dictator to win. And in Cambodia case, as Randy mentioned too, it's not just about pushing U.S. value, it's also interest. And with this government, the U.S. has not getting any either interest or value. And so what's the point of the relationship? You have the relationship so that you can advance your values and interests. And in this case, your values, the U.S. values and interests are actually aligned. So it's a very easy case. And it's a very hopeful case in Cambodia. It's more hopeful than any other place in the region. The U.S. may not actually even have influence in other parts of the region to sort of help to support democracy, but actually you do. In Cambodia, if you look at it that way, it's more positive in Cambodia. Change is very likely, and we are an inch away from big positive change. One last little stretch, and we get there. With the U.S., along with its ally, Japan, and its friend in EU, just to stand up to the obligation that you already signed on.
But does this effort by Hun Sen, this anti-American campaign, does it resonate with voters?
It does not at all. They have tried this for over a year. If you look on social media, you will see that the U.S. is probably the most liked country by the Cambodians. And I think in the region as well, Cambodians probably the country that like the U.S. the most among other ASEAN countries. So no, it hasn't been working for a few reasons. Number one, the population is young. So they don't remember the rhetorics, the manipulation of history that the Cambodian government is putting forward on social media. Number two, the Cambodian public, young and old, see the U.S. as the father of democracy, seeing the U.S. as supporting democracy in Cambodia, and that's what they want. So quite contrary. The Cambodian public have better, more positive view towards the U.S. when the U.S. acts in the interest of democracy. Unlike in some places, whereas the U.S. intervention or I think the U.S. influence may not be welcomed by the public, in Cambodia it's the opposite. If you go on social media, you will see that people are urging the U.S. and counting on the U.S. to take a stand on democracy, which is why, and Cambodians have seen that over the last 10, 20 years that the U.S. has been a strong supporter of democracy in Cambodia, which is exactly why the U.S. is liked by Cambodians.
Olivia, just a point and a question. The point you made about freedom and democracy mattering in Cambodia because it matters everywhere, right? That's particularly true when it comes to ASEAN, and that's sort of the strategic advantage of democracy is that the more the center of gravity within ASEAN is democratic, the more likely it's going to be sympathetic to U.S. positions, and that's why, say, in the case of Burma, it's so important, and why, at this point, we thought we'd be in a better position with that, having supported Suu Kyi for 25 years. We thought her ascent to power would be having a little bit more positive impact in ASEAN. But you can see it. You can see it when Indonesia became democracy, how that impacted the organization, how it affected their positions. But it's 10 countries, and just one is hard to sustain that. We need more. We need more in that regard. The question I wanted to come back to was after the 2013 elections, there was a sustained period of pressure by the opposition. There were protests. There were a mobilization, actually, in some ways, of the international community because it was so present, right? But then they made a decision to compromise with Hun Sen, and I think it actually hurt some of the proponents because we were pushing so hard, and then suddenly, we're alone, and the guys who actually have most at stake had decided to compromise. So, what do you think about that? Is that something we should worry about going forward? I mean, are we going to push very hard on this, and at the end of the day, the opposition reaches some sort of deal?
I think it's difficult not being the person who's offered the deal to say what deal would come. But I think that it did definitely compromise the ability for sort of Cambodian democracy to really mature. And I think that, again, it put the ball back in Hun Sen's court at a moment when the CNRP had the most leverage and power. And so I think it's a good lesson for going forward for the 2018 elections, depending on what happens. But I think it's also a good message to the Cambodian people that they should really be vocal about the fact that they do want this democratic outcome and that they want it to be sort of pure rather than this sort of in-between or halfway point that usually ends up just swinging in Hun Sen's favor.
Do you have anything you want to say about that?
I happen to agree with you and Olivia, but you have to understand that CNRP leadership is complex. It's a merger between two parties, and decisions are not made by one person in particular. It's not. It's made by a consensus and agreement among a few people who sometimes have different opinions, and sometimes one opinion end up being the outcome of it. And I think that was the case in the CNRP making the deal with the Cambodian government then, and that was not something that Kem Sokha supported for the reason that you both mentioned.
Yeah, I guess that's one advantage that Hun Sen has, too, is that complexity. He can play on that complexity to good outcomes.
He's also very good at it.
Yeah.
He's stayed in power for 33 years.
Yeah. Well, let me open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, all the way in the back.
Not at all. They are not capable. They have no human rights commission of any substance, and they have a culture and a way of doing business and a mandate that just does not allow them to culturally impose the kind of pressure on a government that would be helpful here. I mean, they say that they were instrumental in bringing about the Burma junta's decision to stay, to let Aung San Suu Kyi out of power. But it's like when all these people are trying to open a peanut butter jar and then somebody comes along and opens it because of all the efforts. There was 20 years of sanctions on Burma. To claim credit for that because of the ASEAN methodology is absurd. And in any case, that was because the situation in Burma had escalated far beyond what we have in Cambodia.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's very little ASEAN can do. They do have a interparliamentary group that takes positions that are much stronger than ASEAN itself, but
we the Human Rights Council, though, that's where they could make a difference. Yeah. Can I just, here's what could make a difference, an institution we haven't talked about, which is the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council was set to renew the Special Rapporteur for Cambodia's mandate this last September during its session. And a lot of human rights groups pressured Japan, which writes the resolution, to add language that specifically tasked the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Aid, with reporting to the Council on the deteriorating human rights situation in the March session. And this would set the stage to deny Hun Sen the legitimacy if he steals the election, if CNRP is dissolved and he waltzes to victory in 2018. But Japan put that text in, but then when Cambodia complained about it, they took it out. A U.S. amendment to restore some of it was voted down because it was poorly organized and at the last minute. It wasn't poorly organized, it was just very last minute. And so now we don't have much in terms of the UN Human Rights Council. But if CNRP is dissolved, we could seek a special resolution in Geneva in the March session to task the High Commissioner for Human Rights with reporting back on Cambodia in the June session, right before the election. And that would at least create some kind of framework in which to deny Hun Sen legitimacy if CNRP is dissolved. I'm just trying to think ahead here because I think we need to talk about this. If CNRP is dissolved, we now need to talk about what the theory of change of the isolations and sanctions on Hun Sen, which start with denying him the democratic legitimacy. What we cannot have is the election rolling around in July and the international community being divided and Japan, welcoming a process that was not violent, even though it was totally unfair and totally unfree. Meanwhile, the United States says something else and the EU says a third thing. We cannot have that if we're going to proceed with isolating Hun Sen.
Also, on the question of ASEAN, even though I don't think ASEAN has a lot of strength to address Cambodia, it is interesting the timing of President Trump's trip. And so there may be opportunities on the sidelines of ASEAN meetings for President Trump or other officials to make clear what U.S. strategy is toward Cambodia and that it won't tolerate what's going on at present. And so I think there are opportunities, at least in the short term, to use the gathering of the countries to then send a clear message.
I agree with that, yeah. Yeah, hey.
Hi, I'm Matthew Pennington from AP. Monica, you mentioned that sanctions work. What particular measures do you think would have an impact on Cambodia? Is there any particular action by the U.S. that you think would be effective? And secondly, since your father's arrest, have you personally or your family faced intimidation from the authorities?
I think that targeted individual sanction would work. That's including visa and visa ban, and also there's financial sanction that you can do to individual. And I think that's being considered right now, and we hope that can be done on time. Again, time is of essence. They cannot wait and see. The U.S. need to use those leverages to preempt more damages, not in response of more damages. And also legitimacy. You cannot downplay legitimacy. Legitimacy of meaning joining in support of the election in 2018 means a lot to the Cambodian government. If the U.S. works with its ally, again, work with Japan, work with EU in a coordinated manner that if the situation is not reversed by a certain date, then they all had to threaten to pull out from the election support. To pull out the legitimacy from the July 2018 election, you need to do that now, not close to July 2018, because it would be too late then. But yes, please start with the visa sanction, and you know why it works? If you look at the visa sanction that the U.S. imposed on the Cambodian government official, obviously for a different reason, it got a lot of strong reaction from them. Now the Cambodian government agreed to accept deportee because they want the visa ban lifted. So it works. But now let's place a new visa ban for the right reason. And it will work.
And sorry, the question about yourself and your family.
I'm in the list of targeted arrest, which is why I when all of this happened, I was already abroad. And I couldn't go back home because of the accusation against particularly myself and my sister. Actually, that's how this whole process began. My sister and I are accused of conspiring with the CIA, which we find very funny. But it's not funny until they actually would arrest us if we were to be, going to Cambodia at the airport. So yes, we are under physical threats and intimidation.
Can I add for Matt? So to add on the specific sanctions, I mean, the specially designated nationals list the Treasury has a huge economic bite. It's not so much about seizing assets. I don't know how many assets are held in U.S. institutions, but rather from cutting you off from the international financial system, which it becomes very onerous to move your money around, even if it's in a Singaporean bank, if you're on that list. But secondly, using the influence of the United States government to convince other jurisdictions to just enforce their anti-corruption laws. You could tell Singapore to enforce their anti-corruption laws, or Australia for that matter, and that might take a huge bite out of CPP's allegedly stolen wealth overseas. And the other thing I want to say is on sanctions. I mean, at the very least, they will lead Hun Sen to soften his repression. It may not lead to, CNRP being allowed to contest freely and fairly, but at least soften the repression. At best, isolation weakens autocrats' hold on power, and Hun Sen's power derives from his control of the CPP. If the CPP is sanctioned, he will be that much weaker. But I want to clarify, because of the crazy allegations that have been made against the United States government and against CNRP and against civil society groups and human rights groups, no one is talking about a revolution. Nobody is talking about overthrowing the government of Cambodia, whether by nonviolent but admittedly disruptive methodologies of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. Nobody's even talking about that, let alone violent overthrow. Nobody. They're talking about pressure to merely allow a constitutional process to occur, a free and fair election. That's all.
Other questions?
Mona, you talked a little bit about the psychological warfare that's being waged on the people of Burma. While psychological warfare is being waged, there's also been some semblance of success has been occurring in Burma, be it the June elections, the coming June elections for the CNRP and gaining more seats. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the resiliency of the people, in going through all of this crisis and all of this psychological warfare through decades. Can you talk a little bit about how the people are doing out in the rural areas or in the urban areas? And again, sort of talk a little bit more about civil society and how they're planning on moving forward from this. Because these are also all things that, all challenges and barriers that civil society and people in Cambodia have gone through. So talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. So because the effect of the crackdown in last June was not enough. As you mentioned, the CNRP still did very well, unprecedentedly well in the June election, which is why Hun Sen, the Prime Minister, the Cambodian government is stepping up the pressure. For over a year, there has been threat of civil war if the Cambodian ruling party loses the election. There's been arrest here and there of opposition, civil society. So that's been happening before the local June election this year. And then that came down to the office arrest for 6 months of the opposition leader, Kem Sokha. That did not have much of a negative impact on the June election. Why? Because the party was still functioning. He was still inside the office. He was still leading the party. And actually that, in a way, it actually empowered the Cambodian people to stand up against the oppression. And it actually acted as something to mobilize, to garner for people's support. So, of course, after that, the Cambodian government, the Prime Minister sees that, that had an opposite effect because the CNRP was still functioning, even though he was under office arrest. And also then, if you paid attention to civil society and, for example, union and stuff, they had very strong stance immediately when Kem Sokha was under office arrest. They threatened protests coming from everywhere. So people were working together because they were still allowed space to work. Because civil society then was still able to threaten protests. Union and civil society was still able to work in defense of democracy. Which is why Hun Sen imprisoned them. If you remember, 5 of them were in prison for a very long time, longer than Kem Sokha's office arrest. It's because he sees that, oh, these people can still work together. The CNRP is still function as long as its leader is still able to lead the party, which is why now he arrested the leader, and the party now is completely different from when he was under office arrest. For our leadership from top to bottom are scattered everywhere. Some are still in Cambodia but are living in fear and being quiet. And civil society, have you seen this time around, it's very different from last year. The union as well, they're completely silent because they saw the arrest. It was so cruel. It was done in a manner to show that if he can be arrested like that, all of you can also be arrested. And the fact that there hasn't been any solution for him, people are thinking, if the opposition leader is sitting in jail right now and nothing is being done, what about me? That's what civil society and other leaders inside our party are asking themselves, and it's working. It's working in favor of Hun Sen, of the Cambodian government. So what are people fearing right now? Confused and fear. So that's the sentiment from the Cambodian public now, because they don't have information from us. Because we can't even hold internal meeting in the provinces without being threatened, without being intimidated. And some of us are getting arrested lower level. You don't hear about that a lot because because they're not big political figures. So there is no CNRP. Like I've been saying, CNRP has been dissolved already in effect for the last 2 months. There is no CNRP. There's no leadership. There's absolutely no political activity on the ground. So the Cambodian people are just waiting. So they're in a waiting mode while they're losing hope, which is why I'm saying that this is permanent. The damage is permanent. And if this drags on any longer, you cannot reverse that psychology. People's going to lose hope, and it would take a lot more to revive that hope.
We have a question from the internet somebody sent in. I wanted to ask. Maybe Olivia or John probably be good. This is how it reads. It would seem that trade sanctions would be highly likely to lead to action from the Cambodian government, as it would have a significant economic impact. It would be great to hear from the panelists why this is not really an option for the U.S., as no one has raised the possibility as of yet. Because what you've been talking about is targeted sanctions. So why wouldn't broader trade sanctions be of use, or do you mean to leave that out? Is that actually an option?
I think in this particular situation, targeted financial measures will be more effective, just given the fact that these are very specific individuals who are seeking to undermine freedom in Cambodia. I think that there could come a time where trade sanctions would be considered. I know the generalized system of preferences has been one consideration to revoke that. And I'm not sure that we're at that point yet. I think starting with targeted financial measures is sort of the best way forward. One, because it directly affects the people who are responsible for it. And two, because it's likely to have less of effect on the Cambodian people themselves. And so I think that's good to keep in mind, at least in the short term.
What I would say is, the Cambodian economy is different from a lot of the economies where groups have recommended economic sanctions of that type. Like in Burma, the Burmese military owned all of the main revenue drivers, like the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, Myanmar Economic Corporation. So if you sanction those broad economic sanctions, you're hurting the military, and the military has a hold on power. But broad tariff hikes or whatever, any trade retaliation or whatever, using trade preferences to go after the Cambodian economy would hurt Cambodians. And it would hurt rich Cambodians who might or might not be CNPP supporters, but it would be very scattershot and a very poor mechanism for that. But there are to go back to the economic sanctions I mentioned before, there are a lot of economic leverage points. There's the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, which are considering massive direct assistance to the government. If Japan and the U.S. and the EU together started putting big conditions on their lending, not their lending, but on the World Bank's lending and other international financial institutions, that would have an impact. There's also this enormous loan that the U.S. has, that Cambodia has against the U.S., which we haven't talked about. I don't take a position on the loan, but it is leverage. This is an old loan from the Prince Sihanouk days. But I don't think that using the USTR's leverage would be the right way to go here. It would just hit the wrong targets, and it would hurt ordinary Cambodians, and it would hurt the Cambodian economy, and it might even strengthen Hun Sen in a way, because it would sort of say, look, we're hurting because the U.S. is doing this sort of the way it is in Cuba and other places. So I think no. But can the USTR threaten to do those things? I mean, I don't want to have a secret strategy here because this is being live broadcast. But I mean, certainly this is the kind of thing that government should talk about. And when it comes to labor rights, certainly you can put benchmarks in and say, if you don't let unions organize, and if you don't let better factories go forward, then we can't have a trade deal. That's just ordinary, good negotiating. But to impose it on political grounds, I don't think is the way to go.
I would just say start with the individual targeted sanction, and believe me, that alone will work. You might not have to resort to trade cancellation of trade privileges to Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. And just because it's this week and President Trump is on his way to Da Nang, I mean, just to picture this for a second, especially for Matt, as a journalist, you have all these people in Da Nang, Vietnam, and then they're flying into Manila. All these people, Donald Tusk, the head of the EU, the UN Secretary General, Donald Trump, Prime Minister Abe, Justin Trudeau, they could just corner Hun Sen and say, you have to not dissolve the CNRP and drop this ludicrous charge against Kem Sokha, or else we're not going to recognize you as a democratically elected government next year. They could do that. Do I think that's going to happen? Yeah. That would do it. Do I think that's going to happen? I'm not saying that, but that would do it. That's what could happen, should happen, and I wish would happen.
Well, why don't we leave it there? So much more we could talk about, but we've hit so many really important points, and I think you all have been very effective making the case that the U.S. takes some action. So thank you very much for being here. It was a very informative discussion. Thank you.